And we're in this series called Developing a Soul of Resilience. Developing a soul of resilience. And part of it, this has kind of been a little bit of a window into my own soul and my own growth and my own journey over the last few years. And which is always a little intimidating because in part you kind of expose yourself and you kind of have the vulnerability. And but so far I appreciate some of the feedback and the questions and the support and the encouragement. And what we've been talking about, if you're newer here maybe to EFC, it's been a while since you've been here, this whole idea of resilience. What are we talking about? I think so many of us, myself included, we run on empty. But we're so disconnected from ourselves, at least I know I was, disconnected from our own souls, from others, and even from God, that we don't even realize it. There's a reason why all of a sudden we go through some turmoil like a pandemic and political polarization and all of the stress. And even to this day right now, I can't get people into counseling or therapy. It's months and months of a waiting list. And part of it, what I think has gone on, is there's nothing in the tank. There's a dryness, there's a parched, we're thirsty. And even Jesus, we've talked about this series, invites us to come to you, come to me, those of you who are thirsty, who are parched, and I will give you living water. But our souls are so parched that it bounces right off. Like the hard soil that you've seen, even it's dry here. It can't even hold the water. That was a part of my life. For years. And I'm a professional Christian, right? I mean, this is my job. And I didn't know that there was so much missing. It took a lot of different things to help me understand that the spiritual life is so much more than what I've experienced in my own tribe of evangelicalism. I'm incredibly thankful for our tribe. But like anything, it has its strengths and it has its weaknesses. And so in part, when Jesus gives us this invitation, and I love the Message version, this has been kind of our key verse throughout this entire series. It's like, are you tired? Are you worn out? Are you even burned out on religion? And here's the deal. Some of us are going so fast, we're so digitally distracted that we don't even know how to answer those questions until we slow down enough to realize not well. And Jesus says, the invitation, come to me. Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. In the NIV or other translations, you've heard it called the yoke. Take my yoke upon you. Keep company with me. Abide with me. Learn with me. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. And what we've been talking about in this series is this is the secret of the yoke that I never understood until the last couple of years. When a rabbi is teaching like this, the yoke is not only his orthodoxy, his teaching, his doctrine, but there's a whole second part of it, which is his lifestyle. What we call orthopraxy, how he lives life. That's why he's saying things. The way Eugene Peterson unpacks this is the rhythms of grace. Walk with me. That's what, learn from my lifestyle. Learn from the way I'm living and loving. And that's part of it. Fundamentalists typically just look at the orthodoxy. Believe all the right things. It includes that. But it cannot and should not be limited to that. Because truly, it's about living the right way in love. And the secret of the yoke is Jesus brings it all together. And it's an invitation for us. And I think it is a key ingredient to living a more resilient life. That no matter what happens to you and me, that we are filled with the living water. We're filled with the presence of Christ and the peace that we sang about. The life that we sang about. Even though everything externally might be falling apart. That's the secret of the yoke. That's the way and the life of Jesus. So a couple weeks ago, I talked about being before you do. And again, this is a difficult concept, but we looked at Mary and Martha a little bit for 2 weeks, and I've tried to explain over and over again. Every message I've ever heard on Mary and Martha, okay, every preacher, every pastor, every teacher talks about the good of Martha. She's the one that's busy getting everything all ready. And what's Mary doing? She's sitting at Jesus' what? You exegete that passage. There's nothing, he's not saying anything good about Martha. I'm not saying she's doing things wrong, but Jesus does. He says Mary's doing the one thing that is needed, the one thing. And we talked about a couple weeks ago is being before we do. Being before we do. And that's difficult in our day and age. That is difficult in our modern society. We tend to live in a Martha world, and even those of us who are Christians in a Christian culture, and we're doing at such a rapid pace that we're missing the invitation from Jesus to be with him in order to properly live out from a place of fullness versus on empty. And so one of the things I share was an active life in this world for God, to be all that we're called to be the parents that we're called to be the husband and the wife that we're called to be the coworker, to be the follower of Jesus that we're called to be the human being that we're called to be, can only properly flow from a deeper inner life with God. And I missed that for a couple of decades. And maybe you have too. So maybe this is relevant for you. It's called being before you do. And we're going to learn a skill today about how to do that. Now, we jumped ahead because of Omar's traveling and my traveling. I was going to do the Sabbath this week, and I was going to do, I'm talking about this week, last week, but because of our schedules, we talked about it. We talked about him doing the Sabbath. So he did a great message. I'm only listening to about 3/4 of it. I need to finish it up. But this whole idea of Sabbath, this whole idea of the Sabbath in the Old Testament, of just taking a full day to rest and to recover and to delight and to enjoy life. And he talked about, I love what he said. He said, God designed the Sabbath to be a normal rhythm of life for his creation. And yet I think, and I won't ask for a show of hands, okay? But if I were to ask you, how many of you really observe the Sabbath regularly? I already know the answer. I know it for me. I don't practice it real well. And I thought about this. In my own notes, I wrote down, sometimes I write notes down for myself that's in the message that necessarily I don't share with you, but sometimes I do. And one I wrote to myself is, I don't practice the Sabbath because I don't think it's important. Because ultimately, we do what we think is important. We might say something is important, but we actually do and live what really is important to us. And so I wrote my notes. This is one that I know I need to continually look at and work at in my own life. I love a suggestion, starting once a month. Now, part of it is what I'm going to talk about today can help you build up to a full day. And that's kind of where I'm at. Today, it's why it was actually meant to be last week, but we felt like, anyhow, that was for us to discuss, and we felt like it'd be stronger to do it this way for him and I personally. And part of it is what he talked about is slowing down from the busyness and the pace of life. And I mean, I don't have to look around this room. I mean, I know your pace of life, all the ball games, all the busyness and the ministry. And I talked to some of my retired people. You know, my retired people tell me sometimes it's kind of scary. They're more busy now than when they were working. I'm like, how does that happen? You know? But today I want to talk about something a little bit different than pace of life, the external, okay? Not only is it our pace of life, thus the Sabbath, something else has changed dramatically over the last decade and a half that has had a severe and huge impact on our souls. Let me give you a hint of what it is. Something has happened in the last decade and a half that has had a huge impact on our souls. Here's the question. You're waiting at your favorite coffee shop. Maybe you're in there in the store, you're in line, or you're on Washington and you're in the line there on the Washington, on the Starbucks, and you're in line and you're waiting for the coffee. You're waiting to even get the order in. What's the first thing that you do? What's the first thing that you do? Be honest. What do you all do? Show it real high, Melissa. Show it real high. You turn, yep, there you go. This thing called boredom, we no longer know what to do with boredom. We have something to fill the time, fill our minds, fill our souls. Some of you, you might do it. How many of you, let's just do a moment of confession. It's good for the souls. How many of you, you're at a stoplight for less than 2 seconds, and the first thing you do is you grab the phone? Confession time. How many here? Raise your hands. Go ahead. Look at, I know a bunch of you do it. Those of you online, what's going on? It could be It could be at the doctor's office. I've had to do some different things at the doctor's office, and I've done this weird thing, okay? Especially because everybody's got their mask on still. I refuse to pull out my phone. I do this weird thing. I talk to people. And some of them look at me like I'm crazy. They're partially right? But my point is this, we look at it, maybe it's social media, maybe it's Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, depending upon your generation. There's no more magazines. So what are you supposed to do? Fill your time with. And so it's your favorite coffee spot. It's at this traffic light. Here's the other thing. We see it all the time. You're at a restaurant with your family. How many of you ever seen people with almost everybody in the family, sometimes even the entire family, they're all on their what? Their phones. We're guilty of it. I'm there too. That's why I talked about benevolent attachment a couple of weeks before. I talked about the importance of, for me, I'm doing my best. I'm not perfect at it, but I turn my phone off at 9 p.m. and I don't go to it. I don't have anything. I don't look at it until 9 a.m. the next morning. It's like a mini Sabbath. Because what's happening, I'll get right to it, the new normal of hurried digital distraction is robbing us of our ability to be present. And here's the thing. This is all newer. I'm not against technology. I think technology is neutral, but there's always good, there's always bad, and there's always the ugly. And because we don't have the social science studies that actually are looking at this, we don't have any longitudinal studies, but the short-term ones are already in. And this is one of the things that they're saying. And people like me have been saying it and kind of realizing it for a while. The inability to be present to God, if you're a Christ follower here, to others, to this beautiful world, but maybe even more dangerous, to our very souls. To our very souls. We were on vacation finally this last week in a beautiful beach and in a beautiful setting, and I can't tell you how many times on the beach in this beautiful setting that young people were just enmeshed with their phones, entangled. Even my own temptation. But we're losing the ability because of all this hurried distraction, not only our own pace of life, but this hurried distraction to be present to God, to others. And life we know as Christians is all about loving God and loving others. That's it. Jesus made it a sin. This is it. And to be loving well, you've got to be present. You have to be attuned. You have to be there, not just physically, but emotionally and relationally. And apart, we're becoming separate from our very souls. I like the way Andy Sullivan says it this way. There are books to be read, landscapes to be walked, friends to be with, life to be fully lived. But this new epidemic of distraction is our civilization's specific weakness, maybe even more so than hedonism. The threat is to our very souls. At this rate, if the noise does not relent, we might even forget we have any, referring to souls. Title of the book, I Used to Be a Human Being. It's quite the read. I think at some level you could understand this and relate to this. I think as I look back at my own life and my own pace and some of the digital distraction, all of that, that's kind of where I was at probably 5-6 years ago, still a struggle today. And it led me somewhere. And think about the secret yoke, not only the orthodoxy, the teachings of Jesus, but the orthopraxies, of the lifestyle of Jesus. Is there a practice from the yoke of Jesus, the secret yoke, that could help with this? And I wasn't thinking of it that way. I'm just kind of saying it that way in the talk today. But there is, and I didn't realize it, because in part, our tradition, we don't typically go into these things. We've kind of eliminated, I told you a couple weeks ago, I did church history at one of the most incredible seminaries of all, at evangelical seminaries. Church history started 500 years ago, which is not right. It started 2,000 years ago. And we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And that's a whole other story, whole other series. But there's some good. And one of the goods we're going to see more a little bit today in a practice. Another way of saying it is there a spiritual discipline that could set us up to thrive and build resilience, to connect us to our souls and to God and to others, to help us love better. In a world that's getting harder and harder to love, in a world of polarization, in a world of busyness and digital distraction, is there some skill, spiritual discipline, a yoke, a way of Jesus, a rhythm of grace? And there is, if we would have the eyes to see it. And what I'm going to call it is simply the quiet place of silence and solitude. Silence and solitude. Now, I won't ask, but if I were to ask you how many of you practice the spiritual discipline of silence and solitude, I think I know how few hands will go up. Now, what I'm saying there is if you would have asked me that 6, 7 years ago and any time before that, I would have said, oh, I know about it, but there's no way I would practice it. I am a full-blown extrovert, folks. Why do you think the messages go long? I talk to process. That's what extroverts do. And technically, they don't go long because our services are 1 hour and 10 minutes, okay? So if it's 11:30, I still have 10 minutes. Anything over 11:40 is over. Jesus' example. What I want to share with you, I want to give a kind of an overview. I'm going to glean through some scriptures to show you this skill, this discipline, this yoke pattern of Jesus at a high level. And I encourage you, you can download the notes on our eFree app, go deeper yourself, look at them yourself. I always encourage that. But let me give you Jesus' example. And one of them is a passage that always confused me. And now that I look back, I think it's been taught wrongly by me and others. How many of you know the story of Jesus? He gets baptized. Anybody know where is the first place that Jesus goes after he's baptized? Anybody want to take a guess? The wilderness. Good job, Joaquin. The wilderness. It's odd. He's baptized. He's ready for his public ministry. And the first place he goes is the wilderness. When he comes out of the wilderness, what's the thing that happens? Or in the wilderness, what happens? He's what? Tempted by Satan. Matthew 4, verse 1. Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. Some of your translations might say desert, to be tempted by the devil, okay? And after fasting for 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry and hangry and all those kinds of things. The question is, and how this has been taught and prepped and how I've heard it, how I've taught it is, in some ways, it was to be Jesus at his weakest, to be tempted by Satan and all of that kind of stuff that goes along with it. It's when we're at our weakest is where Jesus was tempted in by Satan himself. And you've heard those kinds of talks and messages by people, men and women like me. But what if it wasn't a place of weakness? What if in reality, like me, maybe you've gotten it wrong, it was a place of strength? That's where it fits, because it never made sense to me. Really never made sense to me until I think about it as a place of strength. Now, the word for wilderness is eremos, which could literally mean desert. It could mean wilderness, Joaquin. It could mean also these other things. It can mean a desolate place. It could mean a deserted place. It could also mean things like a solitary place, or even the one I like, a quiet place, a place of aloneness. I like that, a solitary place, a quiet place. And when you stop and you think about it, there are a lot of stories throughout the Bible, okay, where the desert place, the eremos, was significant in the life of some of the key biblical characters throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. Moses, the people of Israel, to be transformed, to raise up as that nation. Elijah, some of the major prophets, the minor prophets even, of course, even John the Baptist, as well as even Jesus himself. When you look at it and you see it, we're going to see a little bit today, it's this place of wilderness and desert. And it's not always referring to a specific or to actually a place of barrenness of desert, but it could mean solitary, withdrawing to solitude and silence. So what if the desert is not the place of weakness, but it's really a place of strength and to draw and to grow in resilience and to connect with God? Maybe, just maybe, it's the height of Jesus being filled in the place of the desert that he met and defeated Satan in that moment. That is an upside-down way of thinking about it. And I think a couple of theologians and pastors have helped me to see that maybe a little bit more accurately. Now, here's the pattern. Interesting. I shared this one a couple of weeks ago. Jesus goes through a full day of ministry, like your day, the office and emails, and of course he's healing people and stuff like that. Some of you do that through Salvation Army and other places too. And it was just a full day, 10, 12-hour day. Kids were running around, all those different things. Think of your day like that. And the very next morning is what Mark reports, okay? Jesus, or I'm sorry, I was going through Mark 4 there, so we've seen all of that. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place. After a full day, didn't sleep in, got up a little early, and went to a solitary place. Just take a wild guess what the Greek word is there for solitary place. Anyone want to take a guess? Eremos. So what happens is you begin to look for this now. When you go through the Gospels, you quickly realize that the quiet place was a top priority for Jesus, okay? And so you think about that. I mean, he made it a point to be alone in silence and solitude. Here's a story from Mark 6, just a few chapters down from Mark 1. His disciples they had been now busy. He had kind of commissioned them. They were doing ministry. He was doing ministry. It was a busy, busy week at the office. I mean, there was lots going on. And so they gathered around him in Mark 6, and they reported to him all that they had done and taught, all the wonderful things that went on. As a result, what began to happen? His ministry, his popularity began to grow. And so many people were coming and going that they didn't even have a chance to eat. You ever been there? Anybody here ever work late at the office, at school? You don't even have time for dinner. You got to get the kids. The ball game is going on. All these. You don't. I mean, you're exhausted. You're already, that emotional tank is a little bit empty, right? That soul tank. And what does he say? Let's turn the TV on. Let's listen to that podcast. You know? Let's go to Buffalo Wild Wings, grab a beer, and let's have a couple of wings. Not against any of those things. But instead he says, come to me. Come with me. Buy yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. Just take a wild guess what the word is there for quiet place. Anybody want to guess? Eremos. You see the pattern. You see the pattern. So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place, to the Eremos. Now, by the way, in Mark 6, I encourage you to look at that a little bit further. I'm not going to expand on that. But what's really interesting is after you keep reading, they try to get away. But remember, that's the story where everybody follows them, and they can't even accomplish that. I love the way that the Bible actually tells life as it really is. Who wouldn't want to be alone with Jesus? I mean, some of you young moms and young dads, I mean, who wouldn't want to have this time? I mean, and just like real life, sometimes you can't get to the Eremos, or maybe you can, but you need to learn some new skills of how to get there in the moment. In Luke's gospel in particular, what's interesting is that you can chart Jesus' life and activity, and the busier and busier he got, the more demand that Jesus became, the more he withdrew to the quiet place, this wilderness, this desert, this Eremos of silence and solitude. Let me just give you an example of that. Luke 15, or Luke 5:15. Yet the news about him spread all the more. So the crowds of people, you know the story, came to him to hear him, to be healed of their sickness. And the very next thing that Luke writes is this. Would you read it aloud with me? But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Guess the word for lonely places. Have I built the case? In Luke, it's over 10 times. In the Gospels, I haven't got the full number, but you just see this. Is this the rhythms of grace of the secret yoke? One of the many. And maybe like me, you missed it. It's incredible. And here's what I wrote in my notes. I don't know about you. The busier and the busier you get, for me in the past, it's the first thing to be dropped. That quiet time. Give me an idea. I asked first service this too. How many of you have grown up or have learned, not saying you're practicing it well, but you learned a quiet time? You learned to do like a little devotional in the morning. Can I just have an idea from you? How many of you learned that as a Christian, okay? Now, I won't ask you the follow-up question. How many of you practice it regularly and faithfully, right? Hey, Rick, that's Protestant guiltism right there. Okay, hey, just let you know. I mean, I'm not going there. I think in part, if you're like me, it's the first thing to go, or it was in the past. Now I relentlessly hang on to it. I won't let it go. In the Myers-Briggs, I'm a P, not a J. You all know what that means? I'm not the most structured and organized person, am I, honey? I am a go by the flow. But these last few years, she would attest, oh my gosh, this is what he does every single morning. I'll share that in a minute. And it's not because I'm great. It's not because I'm more spiritual. It's not because I'm more mature. It's because I have learned I need this. I need this. Because my tank was empty. And part of the reason there's even tears of that song, I was even, in first service and second service, I was kind of welling up with some emotion. And part of it is, when Brandon did this song, we've talked about this. I mean, he's kind of my partner in crime on some of this stuff too. It's a place of joy. And what I've experienced. And what I've learned in the seasons of busyness, and I spelled that wrong, I think, we need more time in the eremos, in the quiet place. And I knew when I left, I was supposed to have some time off in the summertime, and I did. I got a little time off, but my back went out, physical things, couldn't do some of the things, couldn't travel. So we finally traveled last week, and this is my quiet place. That was my quiet place last week. One of the places where I really get replenished. The tank went from 30% back up to about 75%. And part of it is my challenge to myself, my challenge for you this morning is, if he needed time and space, why do we think that we don't? Rick, why do you think I don't? That was really what I was thinking. I didn't realize it subconsciously. But here's the challenge. It's in this place of quiet, the eremos, of silence and solitude, whatever you want to call it. This is where the potential to build an inner resilience. Those of you right now, digitally, this is where you build an inner resilience, because it's in the eremos, this wilderness, this quiet, this solitude, this quiet place where we ground ourselves to God, and our souls can find healing and connection to God and even to your own soul. Now here's the deal. And I'm calling it the discipline is the discipline of silence and solitude. And what I've learned is this. Through some of my own reading and my own experience, I'll share with you, okay? Is that ultimately, when it comes to silence, there are two types of silence, and nobody ever taught me this. The first type of silence really is actually the easier of the two. The first is the external, okay? Silence. It's pretty self-explanatory. You know anybody, maybe you're that person, that when you're home, the TV always has to be on? You know somebody like that? Or how many of us, when we're in our car, that we have to have music on? Or a podcast at the gym? Or in those moments, if you're at the dinner table, even with your family, you're looking at that's the external noise. That's actually easier to get rid of. Benevolent detachment. I introduced that concept a couple of weeks ago. That's where you have to figure out for you ways in which you detach from the busyness and the external noise and the distraction that keeps you disconnected from God and even your own soul. But the second is internal distraction, or internal silence, or internal noise. Let me remind you, I did this, I forget, many months ago. Who is the number one person you talk to? Think about it for a second. Who's the number one person you talk to? Yourself. That's 2 in a row, okay? You're doing it. Gabe, you married a godly woman. You need to be more like Joe Quinn. You are. Love you guys. Think about it. It's the mental chatter. You have a disagreement or an argument with your spouse or a coworker, or there's a bad phone call, something happens at the office, or your kid doesn't act right, or whatever, and what happens? You can't turn it off, can you? Ever notice that? You don't turn off. You can turn a TV off. You cannot listen to the podcast. But it's really, really hard. I had to learn the hard way to turn off the mental chatter. And here's what I've learned too, by the way. Typically, most mental chatter, I might not even know you here in this room, but I think I can share something pretty confidently about what I know about you. Is most of your mental chatter positive or negative? That's why emotional health and spiritual maturity have to go hand in hand. There's reasons. I didn't even realize my own self-talk from years and years ago, things I believe about myself that I'm still fighting through. And the reality is external noise, to get to the external silence is easier. Find a room, find a beach. Well, you can't find a beach around here. Find a park. It's the internal noise. It's getting that internal silence is much, much harder. But here's what I've learned. This is what I was going to share. Silence leads to emotional healing for your soul. Silence leads to emotional healing to your soul. Is it possible that we have external noise on because we don't want to deal with the internal noise? We keep the external noise on, sometimes blaring. And I am all for rocking out to good 80s music in your car on a beautiful day with your windows open. Or if you want to do Christian worship music, that's fine too, do that. Country music is not music, so I do question you there, but it's okay. And some of you, you're thinking about joining a church and you just looked at your husband instead or your spouse and said, we're out of here. He just said blasphemy. He just cut country music, yeah. Is it possible that the external noise is on because we don't want to deal with the internal noise subconsciously? And yet that's the very thing that's needed. Now let me help you understand solitude, because what it is, it does not mean isolation, which is what a lot of people are feeling and experiencing today. Solitude is actually you're engaging your soul. You're engaging yourself with God in the presence of God. Solitude is when you set a time aside to feed and water and nourish your souls. It's a time to respond to those invitations of Jesus. Says, come to me, those of you who are thirsty. Come to me, those of you who are weary and tired and burnt out in religion. You come to me, and that's the quiet place. That's the wilderness. I am more and more convinced the one little window that we have of Jesus in the wilderness, in the desert, the airmost, is the last day, the last night of his life. And he's communing and praying with God. And he even invites his disciples to be a part, but they keep falling asleep. But what if that wasn't a place of weakness and is even a point of shedding tears to blood, but that's where he was gaining strength to do his ultimate act, his ultimate biggest thing he was going to do that took the most internal insides what he needed to do for the crucifixion, to be separated from God. That's where he fed and he nourished his soul with the Father. That's what solitude and silence can lead to. Richard Foster says it this way: loneliness is inner emptiness, and we've all experienced that. Solitude is inner fulfillment. But my concern is how few of us, myself included, have experienced that. Now, part of it, out of fairness, as I've shared, part of it wasn't taught that. Wasn't taught that in evangelicalism. That wasn't one of those things that we put high. And again, but it's a thing that I think you look back in the history of the church, you look at Jesus' life, you look at the early church, you look at the desert fathers and mothers, and throughout, for thousands of years, you see this, but maybe, just maybe, we threw the baby out with the bathwater. Thank God. Some are saying, let's bring back the baby. And could the antidote for your spiritual emptiness, your empty tank, your spiritual dryness be as easy, quote unquote, as something like a discipline of silence and solitude to incorporate into your life? Maybe the better word there, after I looked at it again this morning, I was thinking, Derek, I should have used the word something as simple, because it's simple, but it's not easy. You know what I'm saying? It's simple, but it's really not easy in that quiet place. And maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't because he is absent from us. The problem is we are digitally distracted. We are external noise, and internal noise is keeping us disconnected from him. It's more about our distraction than his disconnection from us. Does that make sense, church? At least that's what I found with myself. And I'm still growing at this. I'm still learning. But I found this to be more and more true, experientially, not just cognitively. One of my favorite Catholic writers is Henry Nouwen, and he writes it this way. He says, without silence, it is virtually impossible to live a spiritual life. I want to sit there for a moment. 10 years ago, I would have said whatever, right? It's about orthodoxy. It's about believing all the right things, preaching the right way. It's about this, it's about that, it's about this doctrine, this thing. It's, spiritual life is all about what you believe. It's all about, sharing your faith and getting people saved from, hell to heaven. But the real spiritual life, it includes the orthodoxy, but it's the orthopraxy. Jesus modeled a life well connected to God the Father. And he's right. If we don't take this seriously, the spiritual life, if we don't set aside some time to be with God and listen to him, there are consequences, folks. There are consequences. And we're already living it. Some of you ask, why are we doing, some of the things that are happening in church world and the lack thereof in the church world, so to speak, and the exoduses that are happening and people walking away from faith and not so much from Jesus, but institutional Christianity. I talk to those people, and they'll mention things like hypocrisy. They'll mention things like a lack of love, a lack of humility, a sense of powering up. Winning seems to be the ultimate goal. I just heard that just a couple weeks ago. Winning seems to be the ultimate goal for you Christians, Rick. When we're supposed to be known by our what? Say it out loud. By our what? Our love. Wasn't it Gandhi that said, I'm all for your Jesus, it's your Christians I can do without? And I know as a Christian, that hurts me to say it. It hurts me to hear it. I don't believe it's all true because I know that there are incredibly beautiful, compassionate Christians in this church and many churches across this country and throughout this world. But it's oftentimes the ones that are trying to win and suppress or to, whatever, have the loudest megaphones and some of the biggest platforms. And we're reaping the consequences. We are. I think John Mark Comer talks about it, and it's a great little book, by the way. I highly recommend it. It's called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. And some of the consequences he brings out is, we feel distant from God. And so as a result, we're living off of somebody else's spirituality, podcasts, famous preachers and teachers, versus developing our own deep connection. For some of us, we're so distant from ourselves, we lose sight of our identities and our callings. Anybody here ever struggle with that? I know I have for years, especially if you're a people pleaser. So we get sucked into the tyranny of the urgent versus that which is most valuable and important. I would add to what he said there, to the very call that God has given to you and to me. We feel an undercurrent of anxiety. Anybody here feel an undercurrent of anxiety? I know I do. The sense that we're always behind, we're always catching up, we're never good enough, we're never done. We're exhausted. We wake up and our first thoughts are, already? What time is bedtime? That's a bad sign, by the way, isn't it? Take note. Worse, we turn to our escapes of choice. We run out of energy to do what's actually life-giving for our souls, saying prayer or silence and solitude, and instead we turn to the cheap fix, another glass of wine, not opposed to wine, love wine, a no show that we're going to stream on Netflix or Hulu, or our social media frenzy or feeds or porn or sex or other addictions. The emotional unhealth sets in, and we start living more and more from the surface of our lives and not the core, the deep soul life that we're called to, that we're invited to with Jesus. And that's why we have why there's a reaction. Sometimes when a reaction happens in your life and you're like, why did I do that? What am I even feeling? We don't even know. Because there's a disconnect. That's where I was living for so many years. And I can still be there, but I'm trying to understand why is it I think and why do I feel the way I do? What lies am I believing about myself? What are the things about why? And I'm going deeper. And part of it, there's been a disconnect from the soul. Because the desperate need for silence and solitude. Because dare I say, I think this is where real spirituality, this is where real discipleship, this is one of the aspects of real transformation takes place. But my guess is you've heard very few talks on this. This is where Bible study, I will say it out loud. From a cognitive standpoint, it can start there. Be renewed by the transforming of your what? Of your mind. But oftentimes in our tribe, it stops there. Orthodoxy, and we lack way behind. I'll own it, in orthopraxy. There's a better way, and that's the invitation from Jesus. So how do you do this? Let me get real practical. I'll wrap this up. Remember, we ended 11:40, not 11:30, okay? You got to find your quiet places. You have to find your quiet places. Now, this can be very difficult, but it has to start here. Remember, there's two kinds of noise. There's external and internal, okay? The first one is easier. At some point, you've got to get to a quiet place. It might be a chair in the family room. There's a corner in my family room. When my back is out, I have to do this all right down. I have to do this on my stomach with a pillow. And I have to lay because I have to do the old Larry Bird thing. I'm going to date myself here, Larry Bird thing here. And the reality is that that's a place. The sunroom for me. I know for Brandon, I know it's walks in the wood. For Dawn, our children's director, it's walks in the wood. And so you're all going to have different, my guess is different quiet places. You probably already have one, you just don't realize it. If you don't, just ask. Try. Again, but here's the thing, it has to be quiet. The phone has to be, if the phone's a distraction to you, you got to turn it what? And it's a real hard thing to do. I mean, you might miss the next newest, greatest TikTok. I know that's hard. But trust me, it's worth it. So find your quiet place. One of my favorite places, I think more and more, the beach. I mean, just the walks, the time with Donna, the time with my son this last week, the time alone. I say time alone. You have to. I have been a extroverted extrovert who now longs for alone time. So it also takes finding your quiet place. You got to take your time at it. Start small. For some of you, maybe it's just 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Some of you learn about the quiet time. And the thing I learned is I got right into the scripture study, and that's where my bentedness was. I went to seminary. I've been trained, teaching. And again, most of my time in the Word, if I'm really, really honest and transparent, most of my time in the Word in my first 20 years of ministry, 15, 18, 20 years of ministry, was actually to prep for teaching. My time now in the quiet place, I don't do anything but go silent with God. And I'll tell you how that works in a minute. It takes time, though, because if you're like me, my brain is ADD. I can think about, I was supposed to do this for Donna, I'm supposed to pay this bill. At the office, I forgot to email Dick Lang. And so here's what I've learned. I actually have a little notebook. I don't need it much, but the first 6 months of trying this, I would jot things down. I used to jot them on my phone, but then what would happen? What would happen? Distracted. So that's why I use paper and pen now, a journal. I don't need it nearly as much. I've habitualized myself to get out of that. But it takes time. It takes to really get silent, to get the external noise, but more importantly, the internal noise. But that internal noise is very important because when you take your time, you finally slow down. That's the wilderness. That's the eremos. That's where Jesus would be in these quiet places. I think that's where he slowed down to be with the Father, to connect with his soul to soul, so to speak. When you do this is what I've learned. You begin to feel. I've told you before, I knew two feelings for the majority up to about 40 some odd years of my life. I am a happy-go-lucky guy. I am the glass half full versus half empty. We're called what? Someone said annoying first service. Don't say that. Optimist was the correct term. And then about 1% of the time, a little less than 1% of the time, happiness. What was my other feeling? Come on, you all know because some of you live it. What? Anger. Because what I didn't recognize But through counseling, over the years, I didn't recognize is that I was so oblivious to my feelings. I would push down, not even know it. I knew it because what happens is all of a sudden your body, when you get real stressed, I will always teach you, I've learned this, your body is a major prophet, not a minor prophet. And when I was in high school and in a young adult and seminary, when I was stressed, my body, I would lose my stomach. I'd pop Tums like they were candies. My ears get red. All the blood. I've learned these little signs that something's not right internally. I've been suppressing or I would be trying to deny, and you can't. Feelings are the gateway to your relationship with God. Don't believe me? Need the orthodoxy behind it? Start reading and studying the Psalms. 2/3 of them are David and others who are pouring out their heart and their feelings over to God. So I've learned how to resist that. I have learned to embrace that. I'm still learning a lot about it. I'm nowhere near where I need to be because it still sometimes can be very difficult for me. What am I feeling? But I've gotten much better. I even have a feeling wheel in my office to remind me of there's different kinds. Discouraged. Or I can feel, things like I feel sad. But all those are pushed together and suppressed. They will typically come out like a beach ball that you think nothing of holding it underwater. One of those balls that you blow up, that you play a little with. They weigh less than like 3 or 4 ounces. Ever notice something? It's like a beach ball. You put that underwater, it's easy for the first couple of seconds. Have you ever tried to hold it underwater for a minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes? What happens? You get exhausted and poof, it comes out. Anger. You start to feel. And what I will share with this is usually for me the negative feelings come first. Why? You all kind of raised your hand. Your self-talk is typically what, church? Those of you out there listening right now, is negative self-talk. And so part of it with that negative self-talk is negative feelings. You see why this is so important? Because you've got to identify. And some of those things you got to listen to. There are some things you have to say, you know what? That feeling leads me to do this action, to say I'm sorry. Or if it's an old voice, I'm not good enough. I'm not valuable enough because I don't, this or that or for whatever reason. And you can know, that's where I realize, no, in God, in Jesus, the river of life, I am fully loved by God. For God so loved Rick Wagner that he gave his one only son. That's where I claim truth or a song or scripture. And the more you immerse yourself in those kinds of things, in those moments of quiet and solitude, you begin to feel and what's really, really hard is then you'll face the good, the bad, and the ugly, like a good old spaghetti western of Clint Eastwood. You begin to face that in your own hearts. And this only happens in solitude and silence. And at first it feels, when I first started practicing this, it was awkward, like anything. How many of you remember how to drive or how to ride a bike? Remember how awkward it is? Or talking to a person of the opposite sex when you're in junior high. Remember how awkward it is? Some of you are still awkward. I'm just kidding. And so, but this is where the work is done. And ultimately, here's what I'm noticing. I can hear that voice of God. I've actually sung that song in my head that Brandon did. Because I love that river of life. It's a reminder in my silence and solitude that the sustenance of my life isn't about how I perform, how well I do, how big my church is, my own health, my own productivity. I am his child first and foremost, and he delights in that. And the more I learn that, the more I can pass it on to others, to my wife, to my kids, to my grandkid, to the people at my church, to the people I come into contact with. I have a place of humility versus ego. Because I'm reminded of the voice of God. Is it possible that in the quiet place, in the silence and the solitude of your soul, that's when you can finally come home? And that's what I'm learning. But it's hard because everything in you at first wants to say, It is far easier to do a Bible study. It is far easier to listen to a message. It is far easier. One of the things we talk about here is to go to an event. I think it's one of the big things I've noticed with Christians in my years myself and in ministry and at this church over the years. Because this is lacking, Christians are desperate for a quick and big hit. At the newest and best, church service, church, preacher, podcast. And one of the things I think is beautiful coming out of the pandemic, I personally, and there's others like me who are thinking, one of the beauties that's coming out of the pandemic is we have made it far too much about a stage and a service, an event, a band, or a celebrity preacher for that big hit. And then the rest of the week, we're parched, we're thirsty, we're empty, because we have not developed the disciplines. And quite honestly, I look at it and go, I have not helped to disciple in these beautiful disciplines that have been so lacking and yet so needed in our lives today. And I'll end with a verse that you're familiar with. I'll do it from the ESV. Is Jesus said this, he said, I am the vine and you are the branches. Another way of metaphor of seeing this, of seeing this connectedness that we so much need to God in the quiet place. It's another visual. Whoever abides in me, whoever remains in me, NIV, abide. The word for abide there is the same word abode, which means to make your home with. Whoever makes their home in me and I in him, he or she will bear much, what? Fruit. And don't forget, the fruit of your life isn't how much money you make. The fruit of your life is not what kind of house you live in, car you drive. The fruit of your life isn't the degrees behind your name. The Bible defines fruit. What are they? Peace, patience, joy, self-control, kindness, goodness. All the things that have to do with love, loving God and loving others, and even loving yourself. Matthew 22. By the way, those are all things that you cannot do, I cannot do apart from myself. I don't need to give examples because you've all lived it. You've all experienced it. I have too. So in part, when I make my home, when I in the airmost make myself at home in me and in him, we can bear fruit. From apart from him, we can do absolutely nothing. That's why this is so beautiful. That's why this is so needed. And that is the incredible invitation. That is an incredible invitation from Jesus. That's part of the secret of the yoke. Maybe, just maybe, this is where we come back to find our home and our soul's home that is so needed. Start small. Start small. Find a quiet place. Let me go back to this real quick and we'll get you out of here. Find a quiet place. This is all in the notes. You can download. This is on the app. Just go to messages. It's all right there. If you can't write these down fast enough, somebody trying to write, you already probably have a spot. Start small. Start there. Take your time. If it's 15 minutes, 20 minutes, just try. One thing I would share too is breathing is really important. Breathing. You know when you're stressed, you breathe like this. You just kind of breathe fast. Slow your breathing down. Catch yourself breathing. I will sometimes just breathe in and breathe out. If you're like me, ADD, distracted, you get a little paper out, some pen, and those things, this has got to go on the laundry list, or this has got to go on the shopping list, or I'm supposed to do this thing. You write those things down. Don't get angry with yourself. Do your best. You're human. You're distracted. You're busy like everybody else. Start there, but then take some time. I think about some of the young moms here and kids in school. I know the commitment is hard. You got to figure out when that is. You got to figure out the time. Dad, same things, and work with the moms. I don't think I did a great job with Donna early on when our kids were younger. I think we tried to give each other some time, but I probably could have done better. I understand, though, because I have a 2-year-old that now lives with us. And when she gets up and I hear those little feet come down the stairs, the first thing she says, always, the first thing she says is, "Pop, pop. Pop, pop." For whatever reason, that little girl is crazy about me. It's kind of cool. And I also, at that moment, if I'm in the middle of it, I'll stop. Because the purpose of the eremos is not the eremos. The purpose is to connect with God, to fill the soul, to love him, and to love others well. And I even say that out loud to remind myself. It takes time, though. It will be interrupted. Slow it down. Slow yourself down. I went through enough. If you start to feel, don't resist, don't push. Write those feelings down. Some of you, maybe it's time to get some good Christian counseling. Don't be offended. I have. Face the good. This is where the beauty is. Face the good, the bad, and the ugly in your own situation, your own hearts, and your soul. And by the way, if you're one of those that believe it's everybody else's fault, there is something in your soul that needs to be fixed. And ultimately, you'll hear the voice of God. That's the beauty of the eremos. That's the invitation. Are you tired? Are you worn out? Are you weary? Jesus oftentimes would withdraw to quiet, solitary places. Just start practicing. Questions, email me. Want a phone call for a couple minutes? I'd be glad. I am not an expert. I'm learning from some experts. I've got some people in my life. Start where you're at. Heavenly Father, I thank you for this morning. I thank you, Jesus, right now for the way that you not only taught your orthodoxy, your teaching, your doctrine, but your orthopraxy, your life. That's the secret of the yoke as well. It's not either or, it's both and coming together. And too often, I know I was guilty of making truth all about thinking the right thoughts and not allowing it to permeate the very core of my life, in my emotions, in my relationships, in my orthopraxy in life, where so many of us are guilty of that. Jesus, thank you that you modeled this. We can see it if we really look for it. I pray for those who are digitally right now on our part of our church. I just pray for them. I pray for Tawny. I pray for Kurt, who's going through a lot physically, for his family, like Chloe, that's caring for them, or caring for him, excuse me. I think of Lisa T. Thank you for her. Thank you for Sean. Thank you for the Lishkas who do our work outside here, but for right now are online. And just thank you that we have technology as a blessing at the same time. I pray for those who are in here. I pray that somehow this would fall on some soil that would at least make some sense and begin to try to experiment. But my prayer is they would know you deeper and more, Jesus, through a spiritual discipline like silence and solitude. And I pray that in the powerful name of Jesus. And the whole church said, amen.